2D versus 3D is a question as old as time itself, a question that scholars have debated for centuries, well before the modern age. While experts have debated this question, I'm not one of them. I know little about the dimensions themselves, so I can't tell you which one is better outright. However, what I can talk about is a small part of how the second and third dimensions work in games. I can talk about combat. Combat is an integral part of most video games, especially action-adventure games. But in 1998, a small, little-known indie title would come out and change everything we knew about combat in games. Ocarina of Time showed us what melee combat in a 3D game could look like, and at the time, it was nothing short of magical. But was it better? Well, that's what this video is all about. 2D combat versus 3D combat. Let's find out which one is better. And believe me, the answer is not what you might think. What makes this special? I know it doesn't look like much, it's just a big guy swinging a big club, right? Well, there's more to it than that. In this short clip, you've seen the secret behind 2D combat. When I first played Hollow Knight, I had to stop here because I recognized that this game was going to be something special, just based on this simple combat encounter. The reason 2D combat is so special is simplicity and precision. In 2D games, you're naturally going to be limited in what your character can do. For example, in Hollow Knight, you can attack in 4 different ways: up, down, left, and right. That's it. There are also spells and a few sword skills, but the backbone of the combat is extremely simple. This simplicity allows you to focus entirely on the threats around you. It lets you analyze and take in each combat encounter, and by extension, the patterns that each and every enemy displays. Furthermore, this precision in character control is just perfect. It's thanks to this precision that each and every single time you get hit, it's on you. There are no animations to get stuck in, no awkward angles that cause you to just barely miss an attack. No, it's just you, the boss, and nothing else. And of course, it's not just Hollow Knight. Most great 2D games have this sort of character precision and simplicity. It's thanks to this simplicity and precision that you can really focus on the best part of the combat: the bosses. Bosses in the third dimension are limited in how they can attack because a player can only see what's directly in front of them. In front being wherever the camera is facing. In 2D, I can see everything on the battlefield at the same time. This allows for 2D bosses to utilize attacks that travel all around the battlefield as opposed to just in front. In 3D games, the focus is always on the boss you're fighting and rarely anything else. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's important when you consider how you can design a boss. The best way to illustrate this is by showing some examples. Notice how many different attacks there are on the screen here. Equally, notice how hard they are to dodge. The game can get away with this absurd barrage because it's in 2D. And so, while it may be incredibly hard, it's fair. It's thanks to this precision that the bosses in 2D games can be so demanding. It's extremely difficult to get this right when you transition to 3D, and as a result, most 3D bosses have more simple attack patterns. This brings up another smaller aspect of this debate. Generally, the pace of 2D combat is faster than the pace of 3D combat. I'm not totally sure why this is, but it might come down to realism. It might just look awkward to have a character moving around that fast in a 3D plane. Or maybe it's just because that much movement with a camera would be a bit too distracting and difficult to process. Speaking of camera, that matters too, albeit not as much. In a 2D game, you don't have control over what you see, you can always see everything. While in a 3D game, you need to focus on fighting, of course, but also on actually making sure you can see the thing you're fighting. The reason I consider this a small aspect is because most 3D games have figured this out, and as a result, there's no real point in dwelling on it. Now, there is a problem with everything I've said up to this point. I'm missing something. In fact, some may argue I'm missing the most important part of any boss fight: the spectacle. The spectacle is the second half of boss fights. It's not a make or break sort of situation, but if the spectacle is good enough, it almost doesn't matter what the actual gameplay is like. The spectacle of flying through the air and bouncing from one rock to the next while fighting a massive monster that threatens to destroy a city is a scene that a 2D game simply can't capture. And that's the key when it comes to 3D boss fights. The visuals are simply more impressive by virtue of being in a 3D environment. A mechanically great fight is all well and good, but a fight with a backdrop like this?
Let's finish this.
Takes a boss to a totally different level. If a boss fight was simply about the mechanical aspects, I don't know if you could really argue that 3D is better than 2D. But it's because 3D brings this incredible cinematic aspect to the table that this debate gets pretty close. And there's another aspect of 3D that makes things even more difficult to call. This aspect, of course, comes in the form of special attacks that take advantage of the third dimension. For example, check this out. 2D games cannot do this. I know I mentioned before that bosses can be more complex in 2D, and I think that's true, but mechanics can be more complex in 3D. These mechanics add a totally new dimension to the combat that just isn't there in 2D combat. So you might be thinking I'm about to end the video and go, so it's for these reasons that 3D combat is better than 2D, but that's not quite true. There's a problem with 3D combat that holds it back from being outright better than 2D. That problem is that 3D is simply less precise than 2D. Remember how I talked about the fact that in a good 2D game, every hit is your fault? Well, that's not always the case in 3D. The third dimension complicates things a fair bit and can result in more than a few deaths that don't really feel fair. But with such a small downside, could you really say 2D is better? No. No, you can't. Well, sometimes. So like I said at the start, the answer isn't clear-cut, but here's what I've come up with. When at its peak, there is no denying that 3D combat is better than 2D. However, because of how the third dimension complicates things, on average 2D combat is going to be better than 3D simply because it's easier to get right. To make 2D combat good, you just need solid bosses with tight movement. It really doesn't take more than that. But you have a hard ceiling that you can't pass. While in 3D, you have a lot more to get right, but you also have a lot more to work with. Because of this, when you get a 3D boss fight right, both mechanically and cinematically, it far surpasses anything 2D could produce. 3D can be better than 2D because while 2D is constrained by the second dimension, 3D has no such limits. Its combat, when perfected, is truly limitless.